There we go. It'll pop up in my chat. Okay, excellent. Hello, everybody. I'm not sure whether you were aware, but October is ADHD Awareness Month. As part of the Operations Research Specialist apprenticeship process, we were looking at reflective profiles. And Harry very kindly started sharing a little bit and started saying, my profile makes sense, but also as somebody who has ADHD and so on. Oh, this could be a really nice opportunity for an informal conversation around ADHD, and we could share this with everybody else as ADHD Awareness Month. So, Harry, thank you so much. We want to make a statement from the beginning that you're not trying to represent every single person who has ADHD in terms of, well, this is what it's like. This is your personal experience, and for somebody who does not have it, at least I don't think I have it, as an educator as well, I would find this really insightful. What is it for you? What does it mean for you? And particularly within an educational context, what are the barriers? What are the opportunities? Just go for it. Just lovely to be able to chat about it.
So, first off, if I kind of start with how I came to my diagnosis, because I think that really alters the experience of someone with ADHD. I basically grew up thinking that the way that I was the normal, right? And my whole family is full of people who have ADHD. Many of whom are increasingly now, my mum's in her 70s and finally recognizing that maybe she should have got a diagnosis, 40 years prior. So I grew up in that kind of environment, and it was only when I started interacting with schooling and other people that I started realizing that that wasn't the standard way of doing things, and that I was doing things slightly differently. But in my arrogance and with my home life being full of people with ADHD, I thought, well, I'm right and they're wrong. Which meant that I kind of sidestepped, I think, some of the experience that you have if you've got a diagnosis as a child, or if it's just you and your family. It rarely is just you and your family, because it is more heritable than height, ADHD. So it's very common for people to come to a diagnosis when their child gets diagnosed, and then they look at their own life experiences. So something that I've dealt with is the fact that because there's this historical assumption that you get a diagnosis in childhood and then you grow out of it, a lot of provisions assume that you're a child. And they also assume, I think, therefore, that as an adult, you don't have any additional needs. And so I'm one of the co-chairs of the Disabled Staff Network in Nottingham. And one of the things that we commonly find is there's a big crossover with people who've got varying disabilities and neurodiversities, all kind of mixture. But when it comes to people's neurodiversity, they've often learned to cope. And because they think they should have grown out of it, they then cope regardless. And it takes, work, study, whatever they're doing, takes a lot more from their life, from the rest of their life, than maybe it should or could. Whereas if someone turns up, they've got, say they need to walk with a cane, people tend on average to be better at identifying, I've got this additional need, I've got this cane. Now, it is not without problems, but it at least seems to be the pattern that people feel like they're allowed to acknowledge the cane. Whereas I almost feel with neurodiversity, especially when it tips into disability, that people don't feel like they're allowed it even. And it's why talking about it is so important, and why talking about it as someone in a professional role who has been successful is important. So I came to my diagnosis when I was about 32. And I did the classic thing of I looked back at my life experience and I went, oh, some of those things I was running all the time and no one else seemed to be. And it was because for me, it was the only way of doing it. So I used to really annoy teachers. I was loved or hated by teachers because I would have a session of something like biology, and I wouldn't be concentrating. I very visibly wouldn't be concentrating. But then the teacher would come to me and what I'd be doing with the homework. Because I knew if I did both listening and homework at the same time, I would learn something. If I did listening, I'd learn nothing. So either a teacher acknowledged that I was, doing my best ultimately, but it was always that it was naughty, like not really allowed. And I think having the benefit now of having a while in professional roles and coming back to study is giving me the ability to go, actually, no, I deserve this. I deserve extra help. Like I need extra time. I am allowed to ask for that. And in fact, if I don't get that, that's a problem. And that's something I should be fighting for. But I don't think without that experience in between of having often very supportive managers, I probably would have come back into study and done the same stuff I always did, which was cope when I shouldn't have to, you know, not actually access the help that was available. And I think also my experience is kind of a strange one in that, because I've done leadership stuff with the staff networks, I've got a bit more awareness of what you're allowed to ask for. But I think a lot of people, they don't know what they can ask for. And then the process often requires you to turn up knowing. Or you turn up and then you struggle and fail and feel terrible. And then you know that you're already struggling and failing now. And you can get caught in a loop where you then don't ask for help.
Mm.
So I think, especially if anyone who's kind of like an ally listens to this, I think it's really helpful to acknowledge, especially if someone's talking to you about something they're struggling with, to be really upfront about what they can ask for help with, regardless of diagnosis, because that's the other thing. It actually doesn't matter often if you've got a diagnosis or not. You know, if you would benefit from someone being louder in a meeting, or, you know, not having a blow background on, or that kind of thing, like, you are allowed to ask, but also you're allowed to suggest that thing for someone else if you think it might help. As long as when the answer is no, I don't want that, you go, oh, okay, just, I know sometimes it helps me, or, you know, just make it normal. So in terms of ADHD and what it is, it's a executive dysfunction, essentially. I'm gonna probably speak incorrectly on this, but this is kind of how I conceptualize it in my head. It's like, if you think about your brain as a series of kind of junctions, there's a really important roundabout in the middle, and mine gets clogged all the time. You know, you can have journeys happening in other parts that are still working fine, but if that central one gets stuck, it can be really difficult to get anything across that space. So that seems worse for certain tasks than others for me. So for instance, languages that require you to map new novel sounds to words that you already know in your memory, that's a nightmare task. I'm terrible at languages. That's not true for everyone with ADHD, but usually the things that people struggle with are those kind of central control tasks. So it's why it's an attention thing. People also sometimes struggle with staying still, partly because moving helps you think, but also because your body can become very uncomfortable, like stuck in the same place. I know that I struggle a bit with my core strength, which doesn't help. I know some people with ADHD basically go to the gym for like 2 hours in the morning before they do anything else. But that requires you to be able to go to the gym for 2 hours before you do anything else. What you often find with people with ADHD as well is that, so for a long time, people thought that you just stopped with a kind of hyperactivity. And it's partly why people thought that it ended, you know, as an adult, you kind of grew out of that moving all the time. But actually, it turns out what happens is people find displacement activities, or they have a bit of their brain kind of whirring all the time, or they get really anxious. And so actually, it's not going somewhere, like away, they're just doing something else with it. So my nan is, I think, where the ADHD came from. And you could always hear where she was in church, because she used to wear like twin sets, and she'd have scratchy, that proper like 1980s scratchy fabric, and she'd sit there doing like this worrying kind of, yeah, so that was hers. And I think that's quite common, you know, that people kind of mask and they cope with these things, but ultimately it's very tiring. And I know if I do something that is a particularly tiring activity for me, I've got less energy to do other things, and that includes study. and it's not always clear, I think, as a teacher, depending on when you trained and how you trained, what that means for a pupil. So my son is going through the experience of primary. Every year he gets a different teacher who has a different understanding, or potentially no understanding, of what to do about ADHD. He ends up having to self-advocate quite a lot at the age of 10 because they don't understand very well. So that's quite hard as a parent, because I'm often in this situation where I'm talking to school and they're saying, oh, he struggles with this, and I'll end up saying things like, well, have you tried, he'll do this activity for a period of time, and then when it's done, he gets the reward thing immediately. He doesn't have to wait at all. That's immediate at the end of it. And they'll go, oh, why do you think that'll work? And I'll go, that's because that's what I do in my work as an adult. That is how I schedule my time. Because if I don't do that, my brain, with my ADHD, I don't seem to make enough dopamine. Or rather, I make enough dopamine, but then it kind of gets eaten up right away, right? If I don't schedule things like that, I don't do my job. But if I had that conversation that frankly with my manager, it would sound like I'm not trying. So that, he's in that position at primary school, having to kind of support and explain to his teachers, but actually in a work environment, I'm still kind of choosing which bits of the truth I share to not make me sound unprofessional. Or when I'm talking to you, I might be kind of, caveating, saying, well, I'm doing fine on this bit. I have to kind of defend against it all the time. Because if other people don't really understand it, you end up looking causal. You end up looking like you're doing it on purpose, that you're not trying or you're not interested. And I think that's where a decent amount of self-esteem issues come from in people with ADHD. It's you're always having to put extra labor into pretending to be normal, pretending to cope, and it's very common for people to have a few things that they fail at, which knocks it out of you if you think you were causal and you could have stopped it.
Wow.
Sorry.
No, this is
Turns out I had a
really
lot to say.
insightful. Really insightful. I love your analogy about that roundabout, and that it gets clogged up around that roundabout as a central function. I think that's a great analogy, a great visual for me, in my own head, and recognizing for me as an educator, because you were part of some of this teaching that I've done, I'm already now thinking, how long were the tasks that I did, and were they broken up in smaller bits, and was the reward at the end of it, was there a sense of, I guess maybe the reflective profile was a little bit like that. You do a thing and then you get a reward and you go, oh, that's interesting, and then you do work on the next one. So thank you very much. It didn't have to be a long one, but I think, as you said, it's worth talking about this, and by talking about it, giving permission for others to be open and to talk about this as well, particularly if they are suffering with ADHD but feel, I guess, lonely, maybe in a sense of isolated, as you're saying, being your own advocate. So thank you very much.
Well, I think also I was just going to say about the reflective profiles. One of the things I think is interesting about it, I guess two things about it. So the first thing is, a lot of that kind of personality stuff assumes that you're making free choices, right? So for me personally, I am actually really shy, but my ADHD doesn't give me a choice. And I'm actually really judgmental, but I can't be really judgmental, because if I do that, it's going to come out of my mouth. So because I'm someone who will just talk, I have to make a lot of effort to be a nice person, because otherwise everyone will know. But it also means that you're often pushed into circumstances that if you're shy and you have the kind of ADHD I have, you can push yourself into circumstances that you're not as comfortable with, that you didn't mean to do. And I think that's a pretty common experience. But it meant that when I was doing the reflective profile, a lot of it is about, it's about this free choice of, what do you want and where can you go? And I just kept looking at some of the questions and thinking, the luxury of choosing, the luxury of getting to decide. I don't think that's just about ADHD. It's also about, if you grow up in an environment where your parents don't have much money, you don't have much to fall back on, the choices you make in work are the choices you have to make to be safe. But it means that when you're thinking about yourself as a professional, that's kind of defined bits of you in a way that's more complicated than can be represented in that. Can't remember what the thing I was going to say was. Oh, except memory issues are common too. But yeah, I mean, I really enjoy a lot of the high level thinking stuff that we do on this masters, because that's my strong suit, basically. Like, oh, that's what I was going to say. So I think, so I said I'm, part of the disabled staff network, but we also have a separate neurodiversity thing at my work because it's not one and the same thing. And you get a lot of people who the reason they are good at their job is because they're neurodiverse. The reason that they are successful in what they do, it is not a disability. It is not impacting on them as a disability at all. And I think that's the other thing that can be difficult to explain, is that there's things that you might talk about where I've noticed that you'll go over some concepts more. And initially I was thinking, why? I forgot that one already. That's because my brain works at the big scope first. That's pretty common. People with ADHD, you can do the large stuff, but not everyone can do that. And so to me, you're explaining this, and I'm thinking, once you explain it again, but it's not for me. So, you wouldn't want to change your teaching style for that small percentage of people. But having said that, there's probably some common things that are good for everyone. In the same way that you should make teaching rooms accessible, generally teaching should be accessible. But I just think it's important to say that it's not by its nature a disability, it's by its nature a difference.
And that's really important. Brilliant. Thank you, Harry. It was good to have this kind of conversation, and I think we should have more of these kind of conversations to come.
Thanks.
If you hit stop on the